Life in the suburbs can get a little boring. Generic houses that all look the same. Tranquil streets interrupted by the occasional car horn or kids playing soccer. I was no longer the guy binge drinking at 2 a.m., attending galas at art galleries, or clubbing at discounted music venues. As a man in his early 30s, I figured it was time to leave that lifestyle behind and settle down. After all, I had just inherited a small house in the suburbs from my grandparents. But I wasn't complaining. Truthfully, I was sick of living paycheck to paycheck, unable to balance paying rent and saving up for a house. But this new life was also a little boring, to say the least. I was craving something interesting in my life, some kind of spark. Shortly after I moved into my new home, a young couple moved into a house across the street. They didn't seem to be anything other than completely ordinary. They kept to themselves mostly and didn't seem to really bother anyone else. To be fair, I had barely interacted with either of them and had no idea what they were really like. But they were young, and it was somewhat rare to see a couple their age buying a home in my neighborhood. I had millions of questions. What was their reasoning for moving into this specific neighborhood? What did they do for work? Did they have kids? I decided I would try to befriend them if I could. Get to know more about my neighbors. I thought that might align with my idea of having a little spark in my life. Slow but steady. One Friday evening, I decided I would walk over to their house and see if they were at home. As I approached their front porch, I noticed that the house was pretty standard with ordinary decorations. There was a minimalistic mat at their front door that simply read, "Have a good day." Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said. As I was nearing their front door, I thought I could hear noises inside. I pressed my ear against the door and could hear what sounded like shuffling around. They must be setting up their new furniture or sweeping the floor, I thought nonchalantly. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I shouted and knocked on the door. A pause and then silence. But it was a silence that felt a little strange to me. I didn't hear a voice or any sound at all. Not even a, "Hey, can you go check the door?" from anyone inside. Just an abrupt silence. It was as if whoever was inside paused what they were doing immediately and were just waiting. Waiting for what? I thought. "Hi there, I'm your new neighbor Steve. I wanted to introduce myself," I half shouted to their front door. Then I paused for a moment, waiting for a reply. I knew someone must be in there. But something didn't feel exactly normal. I decided to laugh it off, though. A lot of people would make it seem like they aren't at home when strangers knock on their front door. It was perfectly normal, I assured myself. Instead of waiting around, I decided I would count to 10 and then start heading back home. As I started counting, though, I heard the doorknob turn and looked back to see the front door start to open. Hi, I'm Steve. Nice to meet you," I said to the man who greeted me at the door. He was perfectly ordinary looking and appeared to be in his early 30s. He greeted me with a smile. He was sporting a buzz cut that was a little too short and had on a pair of round glasses that were crooked on one side of his face. He looked oddly calm, as if nothing had happened beforehand, as if he had just stood up from sitting on his couch. "My name is also Steve. How's it going?" the other Steve asked. "Wow, same name." "Doing good," I replied. "Just thought I'd swing by and introduce myself. It's fairly rare to see someone so young move into this neighborhood." Yes, that is true, the other Steve replied with a smile. But I couldn't tell if he wanted to continue on with this topic or if he was just being polite. "Hey, I was wondering, are you free tomorrow evening?" I asked. "I wanted to invite you and your wife over for dinner at my place. I thought it would be fun. With some alcohol, too," I winked. I don't know why I winked, but I guess I wanted to keep the mood a little lighthearted, as the conversation up until that point had felt a little tense. In reply, the other Steve just stared at me very intently. He had been so calm just a minute ago. Why the sudden change? "Of course, Steve," the other Steve said. There was a pause of about 10 seconds. I didn't know whether I should stare at him back or look at my feet. "But," the other Steve continued, "we don't want you to have to prepare all the food. How about a potluck? We'll bring something and then we can all share. Do you have any dietary restrictions? Any meat that you avoid eating?" "I like all kinds of food, Steve. I appreciate it." "That's perfect," said the other Steve, smiling, showing off his perfect pearly white teeth. We will see you tomorrow. It was nice meeting you, Steve. Same goes for you, Steve, I replied. As I walked back to my house, I was unsure whether our first interaction had been positive or not. The other Steve was definitely polite, but there was something a little uncanny about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was his stare. His intensity made the experience feel so surreal. Oh, who am I kidding? I thought to myself and shook my head. At times I could be bothered by the smallest things. Maybe watching horror movies in my free time wasn't such a good idea. Binging Get Out the night before probably wasn't the best idea either, I thought to myself. Later that night, as I tried to fall asleep, I was mostly just tumbling around in bed. My mind was racing as I thought about a lot of things. My career, my mundane life, yada yada. But I was also thinking about the interaction I had with the other Steve earlier that day. I had been wondering to myself if I had made the right decision when I invited him and his wife over for dinner. I pulled the covers off and got up out of bed, looking out my bedroom window at my strange neighbor's house. Their house seemed very bright for some reason, as if all the lights were turned on. I glanced back at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3 a.m. I noticed that all the other houses in the vicinity were dark as usual. Then, all of a sudden, it seemed as if every light in their house simply just turned off. The whole neighborhood went dark. An odd stillness in the darkness. I went back to bed. Welcome, welcome. I prepared some pork chops, mashed potatoes, and arugula salad, I said to my neighbors who were now standing in my front doorway. I placed the dishes for our potluck on the dinner table. The other Steve's wife looked like an ordinary woman in her early 30s. She was wearing a black overcoat with a red turtleneck underneath. Her slim hands were covered by white gloves that almost resembled surgical gloves. Fashion trends nowadays can be so subtle, I thought to myself. And while she wasn't wearing glasses, her look was oddly similar to her husband's. They both looked like medical professionals, but without any of the warmth of a family doctor. You can keep your shoes on, I told them. I don't mind. The couple smiled at me and entered the house. Hello, my name is Steve, I said to his wife, extending my hand toward her. Nice to meet you. Instead of shaking my outstretched hand, she simply smiled and nodded. She's a little quiet. Don't mind her, the other Steve said. Here, we brought some food. From a side bag, he presented 3 black plastic containers, laying them out on the dinner table so gently that I wondered if there might be jewelry inside. Once the containers were on the table, the other Steve stood quietly, looking at them with a smile, indicating how proud he was. Proud of what? I thought. Do you want to eat first or have a glass of wine first? I asked them. I have some vintage wine you might want to try. Here, take a look. As I walked over to the wine cellar, I felt a piercing gaze behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder. No, that's fine. Let's eat first, the other Steve said. You must be famished. He was giving me a look so intense that it felt like déjà vu. I nodded and said shakily, Sure, we can eat first. I will serve the food, said the other Steve assuredly. I guarantee you have not had this particular dish before. He looked at me with a big warm smile. For the first time since I met him, he seemed truly genuine, kind even. I could feel the enthusiasm radiating from him. I smiled back and nodded. Sure thing. As his wife walked over to the dinner table, her boots didn't make a single sound as she stepped. She gazed intently upon the containers that had been placed out, and immediately, yet slowly, began to individually remove their lids. I was ready to be blown away by their contents. Gold-flaked steak? Foie gras? I pondered. Once the lids were removed, the food that lay in front of me was less than I had expected, to say the least. The first dish was a brisket-type meat that seemed to have been slow-cooked for hours. Even though the meat looked tender, it seemed as if it had lost its original shape, a far cry from how it may have once looked. The second dish was some sort of stewed meat with a side of raw onions. The third dish was a sausage. Just one single sausage that had been boiled, not even grilled. All in all, the food didn't look at all appetizing to me. Here, try them. I guarantee you have not tried this meat before, the other Steve repeated. I nodded awkwardly and sat down. Glancing back at my strange neighbors, I could see they were now standing perfectly still. Their eyes seemed to be fixated on the brisket-type meat that was dangling from my fork. I felt uneasy. "Hey, you guys can sit down," I offered. "Please, make yourselves at home." Despite my polite insistence, my strange neighbors didn't move an inch. It was as if they couldn't even hear me. They just continued staring at me. Reluctantly, I took a bite of the meat on my fork. While it tasted like meat, there wasn't hardly any flavor at all. It wasn't bad per se, but it just tasted a bit odd. As I chewed this unknown meat, I noticed the couple inching closer and closer to where I sat. Closer and closer. I began to sweat. After what felt like an eternity watching them creep closer and closer to me, they were now standing practically on top of me, still just staring. Intently, passionately, deathly. I thought they might be looking at the meat, but I think they were looking at me. But it wasn't my face they were so intent upon. They were looking into my body, my flesh, my soul. The meat suddenly tasted rancid. Reflexively, I spat it out and gagged. The couple still continued staring at me, though I could swear they were practically glaring. Their faces did not move, but their hands were shaking ever so slightly. I don't know exactly what came over me, but suddenly I yelled out, "Get out! I don't want you here!" The couple didn't seem startled at all. They continued standing perfectly still. I ran towards the door, swung it open, and pointed at my front porch. "Get the hell out of my house! Now!" The couple looked at one another, then nodded. Slowly yet gracefully, they placed the lids back on the containers and returned them to their side bag. The whole time they continued just staring at me. It was probably only about 15 seconds, but it felt like hours. And then, finally, they started walking toward the front door and out of my house. I took a few moments to collect myself and looked out my front window. There they were, slowly, gracefully, walking up the steps of their front porch. I ran into the washroom and brushed my teeth vigorously. My instinct told me that whatever was in those containers wasn't something any human should ever taste. It felt illogical, but I couldn't brush past the gut feeling consuming my mind. Later that night, I was yet again tumbling around in my bed. The thoughts in my mind were racing. Should I call the police about this and tell them what happened earlier that day? And what proof do I even have? I didn't exactly know what the right solution was, but I felt so alone. So alone. In the midst of the night, I sat up with a sense of unease. Peering out my bedroom window at the neighbor's house, I could see that all of their lights were off. Dark, like any other house, I thought. This thought provided me some comfort. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe today was just an odd day. Suddenly, I watched as the lights in their house flashed, blinking, twice, then darkness, then silence.